spend a little bit of time, I'm not going to be teaching or preaching like I normally do for a half hour or so. It's going to be a little shorter one this morning. But I want us to get through the book of Titus. And we started this about a month ago or so, and got this week and next week Sunday. So if you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open them up to Titus chapter 3. The book of Titus chapter 3. If you were here the last couple weeks, you might remember we looked at older men, older women, younger women last week, the last couple of weeks, and how they all fit together. This week it's an interesting one with Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. We, right now, and we live in a time which is sort of interesting politically. We live in a time that people say that we're very polarized. All the way from way right wing, all left wing, and just way far apart from each other. And it's interesting to me because just in my own life, being brought up in the 60s and then the 70s, remember the time within the 60s with the Vietnam War and how that polarized America. And some of you can recall that time period. And then we had the early 60s with the shooting of President Kennedy. And that was a big issue because President Kennedy was a Catholic. So people questioned that whole idea. So you move through with that, and you had Martin Luther King and the civil rights, which we are so blessed that we have the civil rights for all people within America. But that was a polarizing time within our nation. And then you go into the 70s, and we had the Watergate issue. And if you follow me, we have been going on from year to year ever since I've been alive. And I'm sure those of you that are older than me can look back and say, wow, as a nation, we tend to be polarized. I think sometimes we in the church can be polarized. But you see, there's a difference. You may be Democrat, you may be Republican, you may be an independent, you may be a Green Party. Green Party? Isn't there a Green Party? You may be the Green Party person. But I think there's something deeper for us to understand. It gets into the view of about 6-8 months ago, I was talking with somebody in their mid-20s about vehicles and about vehicles that get good gas mileage. And I used to have one that got about 40 miles to the gallon, and I really missed that and would like to have one like that again. And they said, well, you know, it's the Democrats who are concerned about the environment, so it's the Democrats who drive the Priuses and drive these cars. And I looked at it and said, what? The Democrats? I think it needs to be if you are a Christian. Not saying you got to be a Christian to drive those cars. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, what does it say in Genesis? God created heaven and earth, and He called it good, and God gave heaven and earth to us, and He tells humanity to be good stewards of it all. So as a Christian, we should be more concerned about the environment than any environmentalist. As a Christian. What Paul is saying here in Titus is, as a Christian, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or anything in between, but as a Christian, if you take that name Christ into your life, we should be the best citizens of the nation that we live in. We should be the best citizens of the nation that we live in. Where do I get that from? Well, go with me to Titus chapter 3, verse 1. Titus 3, verse 1. Maybe go with me. Okay, Titus 3, 1 and 2. Remind the people to be subject to the rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and to show true humility towards all men and women. Here's just a very simple list, almost a checklist of how we can look at our life and say, okay, as a Christian citizen, having dual citizenship here in the USA, but also in heaven, and that's the number one citizenship we have, how do we do these? How are we walking as a citizen of the United States? Well, it's interesting, the first part of the verse here, Paul says is, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities. Well, the word here the idea here within the Greek is, it's a twofold. The one is the military idea about being subject to the rulers. It's when the military divides up the men and women into companies and battalions and divisions, and they all come underneath a leader. So it's dividing up and following within that organizational structure. But the Greek word here is also referring to voluntarily putting yourself under. Voluntarily saying that you will follow, you will cooperate, you will assume responsibility for what goes on. So what does Paul say? He says, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, when Paul is writing this, we got old Nero on the scene. Nero, the Roman emperor. And Nero, as you can recall, was very cruel to Christians. Martyred many, many Christians. Christianity, for the first 280 years or so, up until Constantine came in, Christianity was you would take your life into your own hands if you became a Christian. So you can say, why would the Christians want to listen to the government? Paul, are you crazy? But it's just not Paul that says it. In the book of 1 Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king or the supreme authority, to governors, and love the brotherhood, believers, fear God, honor the king. So Paul says to submit to the government. Peter says to submit to the government. But we're not alone yet. There's somebody else that actually says it. Jesus Christ himself in Matthew chapter 22, when the people are trying to trick him into saying, who are you going to follow? Are you going to listen to Rome, or are you going to listen to faith? Jesus says, why are you trying to trap me? Because he's asked the question, is it okay to pay taxes to Caesar? And he says, why are you trying to trap me? And I think most of us know this verse. And Jesus said, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. Isn't that beautiful? We are citizens of two kingdoms, but the one overshadows the other. The citizenship of heaven. But Jesus says, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's. In other words, the same thing that Paul is saying, remind the people to be subject, to follow in, to voluntarily, in some respects, assume responsibility. So what are we called to do within this? Paul says, to be obedient. To be obedient. To follow through with what we're called to do as a society. The idea here, oh man, I didn't change that wording, did I, Hank? You all can't see that, but right there it says law-abiding. To be obedient is to be law-abiding. Yesterday I took the grandkids down to the Texas Corners Fire Department. They had an open house. And I happened to run into the deputy sheriff there. We had a great conversation. Wonderful, wonderful gentleman. And I just said to him, you know, with all of these housing areas in Texas Heights where we live, we have all these stop signs. It would be so nice if they were yield signs. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, it really would be, because most people don't stop at them. I go, well, that's why I wish they were yield signs. And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, and those of you that live there are the worst offenders. I'm thinking, oh no. I'm wrong with that. But what am I called to do? To be obedient means that we are law-abiding. Imagine if we don't have laws within our society, it creates chaos. You know, some scientists today say, well, there's no God because, look, we can prove there's no God. Forgetting the reality that in 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, science came forward because Christian scientists were saying there is order in the universe and God created that order so we can study it. Law abiding. Be ready to